It's my belief that we're giving the injections wrong.
To put it in a very superficial, blunt, idiot comedian on the internet way, what's wrong with mRNA technology?
Well, the main thing is that because we haven't used it on a mass scale before, there's lots of things we don't know about it. Remember Donald Rumsfeld? He said, well, we've got known unknowns and we've got unknown unknowns. So there's things that we knew we didn't know about it, but then there's things that we didn't know we didn't know. So what's actually happening with these vaccines is you inject it. Now, what's supposed to happen is it's supposed to stay in your arm, maybe a bit go into your lymph nodes under your arm and generate a localized immune response there, but that has an effect on the whole body. But what we now know is happening, for example, with these mRNA vaccines, is they're actually being systemically absorbed to a degree. They're going everywhere. So what happens is you've got one of these lipid nanoparticles with this mRNA recipe inside for the antigen. If that goes into a cell in your arm, the cell in your arm makes some of the antigen, some of the spike protein. The immune system recognizes that spike protein as being foreign and generates the immune response, and that's good. And because there's inflammation associated with the immune response, you're going to get a sore arm. Well, big deal. You know, I can live with a sore arm. But if the systemic absorption of this, and this is what hasn't been fully answered at the moment, but there is data that's showing that these are systemically absorbed. If they're systemically absorbed, then suppose that mRNA lipid nanoparticle, one of billions, is going through a blood vessel in your heart, for example, then that lipid nanoparticle can come into contact with the vascular endothelium inside your heart vessels, inside the blood vessels in your heart. And because the lipid nanoparticle has got a fatty wall and the cells in your heart have got a fatty wall, they will absorb into each other, just like you know when you have two bubbles and they just absorb into each other when you're playing with bubbles. It's just like that. The membranes kind of merge together, and that would let the mRNA into the cells now, but not in your arm. Now the cells that the mRNA is going into could be in your heart. But the same thing will happen. The mRNA is the recipe to make the protein. Then the heart cells will make the protein, and the heart cells will export this protein onto the surface of the cell, and it will stick onto proteins on the surface of the cell. It's called presentation. So all cells can be what we call antigen presenting cells to some degree. Then the immune system will come by and say, oh, that on this heart cell, there's a bit of foreign material, bit of spike protein. That's not supposed to be there, because that's what the immune system does. It recognizes the difference between itself and what's not itself. And so what it does is it mounts an immunological reaction to that foreign spike protein, but it happens to be in the heart. And when you get the immunity, you also get inflammation going with it. And if you get inflammation in the heart muscle, that's called myocarditis. If you get inflammation in the pericardium, that's called pericarditis, which we don't want these things. So the problem seems to be that there is systemic absorption of these lipid nanoparticles. And as well as that, this is another one of my big themes. It's my belief that we're giving the injections wrong. So what you're supposed to do when you stick a needle in, so might have someone somewhere. You stick a needle into someone like that. So you stick it in, and then what you're supposed to do is draw back on the plunger. And then if you're in a blood vessel, you'll get blood going into the syringe. You'll be able to see it. And then you know not to inject, because the injection that we're giving for vaccines is supposed to be intramuscular, into the muscle. Whereas if you hit a blood vessel, it goes into a blood vessel, that would become an intravascular injection. Could be a vein, could be an artery, more likely to be a vein. And that means it would be systemically absorbed really quickly. It could go all around the body. And we don't want that. So I think what we should do is change the guidelines to say, nurses and doctors, vaccine givers, stick the needle in, draw back. When you're satisfied you're not in a vessel, then inject it. Because I think a proportion of the injections that we're giving are going straight into a vein, and then we're getting even more systemic distribution.
And John, the obvious question therefore is this. What's the data on the concerns that you have about myocarditis and pericarditis?
Yeah, so there is definitely an admission now, if we take the mRNA vaccines, that they is a risk of myocarditis and pericarditis. Now, you can argue about the levels of these. The problem is that most of the data that we get after the release of a drug in the UK comes from what we call the yellow card scheme. Of course, now it's all on a computer, but we still have these yellow cards in the back of the old in the back of the books. In fact, if you look in the back of these are the books here with all the drugs that you can prescribe in, and still at the back there's some yellow pages that you can fill out any adverse events in, although it's mostly done on a computer now. But the British Medical Journal actually published an article saying that only about 10% of serious adverse reactions are reported. And for less serious adverse events, it's probably only 2 or 3% that are actually reported. So the question is, to what degree is there underreporting of these side effects? Because very often there seems to be a bit of a pressure on doctors and nurses not to say anything bad about vaccines. And as well as that, if someone gets myocarditis or pericarditis, maybe people never thought to ask how long ago it was since they had a vaccine. The connection might not have been made. So we have underreporting. So we know it causes some myocarditis, some pericarditis. We're even allowed to say that on YouTube now because that is known. The question is the amount. Is there significant underreporting? And what is the risk-benefit analysis for the individual? So in health, if I was treating either of you guys for anything, I wouldn't say, well, what is good? You know, if I'm treating Constantine, I wouldn't say what's good for Francis, and I'm treating Francis, I wouldn't say what's good for Constantine. You treat the individual. This is the whole point. So it's all about risk-benefit analysis for the individual. So the idea that you would give a young man an mRNA vaccine for a disease which for them is very, very likely to be trivial, never guaranteed, but very, very likely that a fit 18-year-old is not going to get very sick from COVID, especially a young fit man who are more prone to these conditions. The idea that you would expose them to that risk of pericarditis or myocarditis, the risk-benefit analysis for them, to me, just simply doesn't add up. And in fact, if you look at the risk-benefit analysis, assuming that the risks of adverse events is around about 1 in 1,000, it basically doesn't add up for anyone anymore from a much less serious Omicron infection. So basically, times have changed. Risk-benefit analysis has changed. And I don't like this idea where everyone's treated the same. So I think every intervention now, especially as we're not in a crisis situation now, every intervention, whether it's a vaccine or giving a paracetamol or giving an ibuprofen tablet, should be what is the potential benefit for you as an individual human being? What is the potential risk for you as an individual human being? And we know that young men, for example, are more prone to myocarditis and pericarditis from mRNA vaccines with essentially no risk at all from severe COVID, especially now there's a lot of natural immunity around. So the risk-benefit analysis should be calculated on that individualized basis.